안녕하십니까? 제17회 제주 포럼에 참석해 주신 여러분 반갑습니다. 지금부터 테크노폴리틱스의 시대 미중 기술 경쟁과 한국의 선택 세션을 시작하겠습니다. 본 행사는 동시 통역이 제공되며 통역을 원하시는 분들께서는 자리에 놓여 있는 수신기를 착용하시기 바랍니다. 한국어 채널은 1번, 영어는 2번, 중국어는 3번입니다. 감사합니다. 세션의 진행을 맡아주실 좌장님을 소개해 드리겠습니다. 좌장님은 유상영 연세대학교 교수님입니다.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 17th Jeju Forum. Thank you for joining us today for the era of techno-politics, US-China tech rivalry and South Korea's choice. Simultaneous interpretation is available for this session. For service in Korean, set your device on channel 1. For English, select channel 2. For Chinese, select channel 3. Now, I would like to hand over the stage to Ru Sang-young, Professor of Graduate School of International Studies at Yonsei University, who will moderate this session. Everyone, please welcome Professor Ru Sang-young.
감사합니다.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to be serving as the moderator, and my name is Sang-young Ryu. The AI moderator made excellent introduction. I really don't know how to thank the AI moderator. So I was a bit concerned for a moment, as to how best I should thank the AI moderator. We are going to be discussing today about technological development, peace, and politics. And we have invited wonderful panelists to be with us. From China, we have Dr. Liu Charles Yangsheng, who is the Senior Fellow at Taipei Institute. And Dr. Liu has worked in the financial industry in the United States. So he knows about the market. He knows about the economy. And currently, he is living in China. And of course, he's still very active and provides very good advices and ideas to the Chinese government. And Taipei Institute has established a knowledge network and cooperative relations with East Asia Foundation, which is the host of this session. So, welcome, Dr. Liu. And from Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, we have Senior Fellow John Bateman. And for the topic that we're going to be discussing, you understand the vice chair of Huawei was arrested about 5 years ago at the Vancouver airport, and that brought about the rivalry between the US and China. And there have been many reports that have been released from the public as well as the private institutions. And John Bateman's report, I read this, and it was quite impressive. And I hope that we'll be able to have excellent discussion about his paper. So welcome, Dr. Bateman. And we also have with us attorney An Jung-sung. He did his JD in the United States, and he also took part in course negotiations. And currently, he's working. He is serving as a visiting professor at Graduate School of International Studies at Yonsei University. I believe his comments today are going to be very interesting and very insightful. And we also have Ha Won-soon from the Korea Economic Daily. He's an editorial writer at this paper. It's been about 33 years since he has been working for the media. And whenever there has been the government changes here in Korea, there have been changes in in policies. And however, Mr. Ha Won-soon has been making very constructive suggestions to different governments, regardless of the government's policies or the policy stance. So welcome all the speakers and panelists. And let me just explain how we're going to be conducting this session. This theme, the theme of this session has been discussed so many times since I believe 5 years ago. And what we have been discussing about the democracy, human rights, or the international rules, well, I believe they're not as important as they used to be. National interests or domestic politics are actually dominating, not human rights or democracy as it used to be 5 years ago. And there was also a lot of discussion on what Korea should do in this against this backdrop of U.S.-China tech rivalry. And I hope that through today's session, we'll be able to make some progress in terms of discussion of what Korea's choice should be. So we should be discussing what each country's strategies should be. So we will be listening to three panelists from three countries. I want them to talk for about 5 minutes, and then we'll listen to a discussion or panel discussion, and then I'll be asking questions, and we'll have more in-depth discussion afterwards. So we'll hear from the U.S. So, John, I would like to ask you to talk to us about U.S.'s strategy and about U.S. interest. And so, are you? So, this is the cover page of the report. I was truly impressed with this report, and I think that's a report that is needed most by the U.S. And I think it's also a report that could also be quite useful to China. And I think John might be able to introduce this report to us. And when this rivalry should stop in order to be helpful both the U.S. and China. It's very analytical. Of course, in democracy, we cannot have a full agreement from everyone. And so and he provides very sharp analysis and very rich content in this report. So for next 5 to 6 minutes, John, could you please talk to us? So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome John Bateman.
That very kind introduction, and it's wonderful to be back at the Jeju conference, which I was pleased to attend 3 years ago, and I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person today, but thank you for welcoming me virtually. As we've just heard, this is a topic that's been discussed many times in the last 5 years, and I've written a very long report about it, so I'm going to try to summarize it in 5 minutes and be as clear and relevant as I can. What I describe is a process called technological decoupling between the United States and China. And what I mean by technology is really almost everything from semiconductors to social media to data flows to drones, although each of these technology sectors is not touched in quite the same way. And what I mean by decoupling is a gradual, partial, iterative process of reduced interdependence between the two countries, a reduction of the flow of people, data, goods, products, know-how, finance, and everything else that goes into a finished technology product. Now, my major interest is in U.S. government policy, but I want to be clear that technological decoupling is a phenomenon that is not solely driven by Washington, D.C. The Chinese government is involved. Other governments, including South Korea, are involved, and the private sectors in all countries are centrally involved. So there's really a dynamic process in which the actions of all of these parties contribute to an overall cycle of partial iterative technological decoupling, which I do believe was initiated by the US government over the last, let's say, 5 years, and has been accelerating over time. The key thing to understand about this decoupling from a US perspective is that actually no one knows where it's all going. There is no clear end state or strategy as of yet. It is plausible to imagine that we could eventually go all the way, that the world could somehow separate or divide into two more or less distinct, or more than two, more or less distinct technological spheres. That's one possibility. It's also possible, although increasingly unlikely, that the situation will stabilize somewhere close to where we are now, and that we could have a largely globalized technology supply chain and ecosystem with small exceptions for key security interests. I think that's actually less likely. But we'll probably end up somewhere in the middle, but actually no one really knows that. And actually, the people in charge in the United States setting US policy at a high level do not have a clear sense in their mind of where they'd like to go, and there's no consensus amongst them. Now, this is somewhat understandable. The US system often does not produce clear strategies for major issues. That's part of democracy and the fragmentation of authorities in US law. But we've also seen a very, very abrupt intellectual and political shift on China and technology. Just 10 years ago, the Obama administration's national security strategy said that we will pursue a positive, constructive, and comprehensive relationship with China. No one would ever say that today. And just 5 years ago, ZTE, the Chinese telecommunications giant, was removed from the US entity list in a deal with the Trump administration. That would never happen again today either. So let me just say that although the strategy for the US government is unclear, the policy objectives can be specified. And in my report, I try to outline 9 different things that the US government is actually trying to do, from protecting its military edge to countering espionage, preventing sabotage, blocking influence operations, countering authoritarianism, protecting free trade, competing and leading in strategic industries, gaining leverage over China, and influencing US domestic politics. There are so many reasons to pursue a decoupling agenda that it fuses into an amorphous threat in the minds of many and breeds unclear thinking. It's also very helpful for putting together coalitions. So, for example, human rights defenders are increasingly interested in harsh measures against Chinese tech companies, just as those who have a domestic political reason or a military concern might be. I don't want to talk for too long, so let me just make 2 quick final points. The general features of US decoupling policy can be broken down into 2 aspects, what I call defense and offense. Defense includes restrictive measures such as export controls, investment screening, visa restrictions, law enforcement actions. These have been intense, innovative, and wide-ranging over the last few years, setting new precedents in US law and in international practice. The fact is that these are easy to implement. The US government has all the authorities that it needs. These are popular actions. There's limited resistance. Many corporations might be uncomfortable with them, but they're politically afraid to speak up. So we will continue to see a trickle of these actions, and in fact, they're hard to keep up with. On the other side of the equation are what I call offense, or running faster, self-improvement, things that the US government can do to improve America's own technological strength and resilience at home. The major activity here was the recent passage of the CHIPS and Science Act, but this was very difficult to get done. And this is almost the only major offensive action that the US government has taken in recent years. It's hard to envision a great deal of new actions like this in the future, given the intransigence and fragmentation in Congress. So we will continue to be skewed toward defense with unknown risks associated with that. I'll just finally say that when we consider U.S. strategy, there are multiple camps competing to set the agenda. The formerly dominant camp was what I call cooperationists, folks who believe in win-win technological engagement between the two countries. This would include early pioneers of the internet, many scientists, corporations, the business community. The cooperationists really have very little influence today in Washington. That leaves the major debate between two other camps. The restrictionists, who have a zero-sum view of the U.S.-China technology relationship and want harsh, increasing measures, whether for military, human rights, or other reasons. And the centrists, folks like me, who believe in a narrow and selective use of restrictive or defensive measures, and who want to take things slowly and carefully using case-by-case analysis with the best evidence available. There are lots of people like me who are centrists in the think tank community and academia, but increasingly the political conversation is dominated by restrictionists. There is almost no important U.S. political figure who is vocally making the case for limiting the path of decoupling with China. And as long as that's the case, the political environment will continue to constrain policy options and move us toward harsher and harsher restrictive measures. And my greatest fear is that eventually a tipping point will be reached where there are feedback loops that cause decoupling to become an escalatory spiral that moves beyond where any party would like it to go. So I'll just leave it there. Thank you very much.
네, 대단히 감사합니다.
Thank you so much. What you said has summarized the perspectives. I think what you said can relate to both U.S. government and the Chinese government and also the Korean government as well. And because of the time constraint, I'll skip the summarization. With that, I would like to invite Senior Fellow Liu Charles Yang Sheng. Like I said before, I think he's one of the best experts when it comes to the market mechanism. And I believe that China has maintained a defensive position and status for quite a long time, but what would be the status and what would be the national interest of China? With that, I would like to invite Senior Fellow Liu. Please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, we cannot hear you. Mr. Liu, we cannot hear you.
Hello? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, okay, yeah. Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you very much for inviting.
네, 초대해 주셔서 감사합니다. 이 자리에 있을 수 있게 되어 아주 기쁘게 생각합니다.
Yes, express my appreciation and also Mr. Bateman's presentation. I am, first and foremost, I'm a businessman. I'm not a scholar. I also have a JD. I studied at Princeton, but for the last 30 years, I've been a businessman. So my perspective would be more from a business perspective rather than the geopolitical aspect. From a business perspective, why I moved from New York to Beijing? Because the opportunities were here. The last 30 years, we've seen an incredible development in China, building the most sophisticated supply chain, I think, in human history, and managed in a very sophisticated way. That's unparalleled or unrivaled anywhere. The infrastructure, the supply chain, and also, I think the scale of the massive Chinese market contributes to creating the economies of scale, which is also very, very, really phenomenal. For businessmen, what we look for is efficiency enhancement. And that's what globalization has brought us. Efficiency enhancement which increases profitability. Now, on the technology side, more than a decade ago, I think Mr. Bateman would know the company Applied Materials, one of the major chip manufacturing equipment company that's done a lot of business with Samsung and Korean companies as well. I was on the board and I was chairman of the investment committee. So I followed the chip sector for also quite some time. In terms of U.S. trying to disengage from China in the tech side, I don't think it's possible. First of all, just on the chip side alone, how can you build factories in Arizona and Texas when you don't even have the engineers that's required to build these factories? The cost basis will be multiples of what it would be in Asia, in China or in Korea or in Taiwan. And then you won't have the engineers because all the top brains in the US over the last 3 decades, instead of going to electrical engineering, they went into financial engineering. And it's very, very difficult to even find the operating teams to do it. So what we end up with from the Chinese perspective is, I totally agree with what Dr. Bateman said. US does not have a strategy in terms of how to deal with this. You need infrastructure, you need engineers, you need technicians, and you need a supply chain that allows you to be more efficient. You make chips in the US, you got to ship it to Asia and to manufacture into products in Asia. You know, where's the efficiency there? Just the shipping alone is, as we've seen in the last 6 months, can be very, very costly. And then I think Chinese objectives are very, very clear. What they've done the last 30 years is to build the supply chain, build the industrial base, covering the entire industrial sector. Every sector you can imagine, they build a base. And using domestic market economies of scale to enhance efficiency and increase profitability. This increased profitability is not just for China, but it's for European and American companies. More cars are sold by General Motors in China than in the United States. 40%, or more than 40% of Volkswagen cars are sold in China. So you cannot ask these corporations to move away, to give up the Chinese market. It just doesn't work. What the Chinese government's objective, I think, in terms of policy, is actually quite simple. Let's do business. Let's create greater value. Let's create greater wealth. Let's improve the life of our people. Now, I don't see that as a part of the strategy of the US. Biden administration could have taken the trade tariffs imposed by Donald Trump's trade war on China when he took over last year, because that would have taken at least a point and a half off on the inflation front. But no, he didn't for political reasons. Didn't want to look as he's being very soft on China. Now, how can you not consider the well-being of your people and play politics with their well-being? So I don't think the U.S. really has a strategy, and I think there's too much politics there. And friendshoring, for example, asking Korea and other allies to basically disengage from China. I don't think Korean companies will be very happy with that, because its exports principally move to China, especially in the chip side. So it's asking Korea to shoot itself in the foot or commit suicide. And this is not just Korea, but many others as well. I think for the Chinese side, we all want to just continue to do business, to improve our mutual benefit. And there's no intention of China to set up 800 military bases worldwide like the US. There's no intention of China to invade any neighboring territory. What we see is the Chinese are more concerned about improving the livelihood of its people and creation of wealth for society. And unfortunately, because of the COVID situation, the people-to-people communication has really been reduced significantly, which is really bad because, as Dr. Bateman said, that the mood in Europe and the United States, among the Western countries, are really anti-China now. I think that's really very unfortunate. I hope events like what we're participating in now could help to promote mutual understanding, because the problems that the world faces, technology is a very small part of it. I think the heat wave that destroyed much of Europe, China, and the United States, running rivers dry, lakes dry, it's climate change. It is so significant. If we cannot collaborate even on something as major as that, I think the technology side is very, very small. It's very minor. I really hope that the global community would get together and collaborate on some of the bigger issues that actually affect, I think, the survival of the Earth. Thank you.
네, 대단히 감사합니다.
Yes, thank you. Well, we do see dramatic changes in geopolitics and domestic politics. However, I believe the seed of cooperation comes from businesses or economic activities. And so Charles's presentation from a business perspective, I think are very insightful, and could also, what he just said, I believe can be helpful to both Chinese and the U.S. government. Now, as you know, Korea is caught between these two large powers. What sort of cost should we pay in order to survive? I mean, this could be an opportunity as well. This could be a challenge. What sort of choice can Korea make? And this is a very critical issue. This is not an issue of politics, value, or hegemony. This is a matter of life and death. I believe it's such a urgent issue. I'm going to now invite Attorney An Jun-sung to make comments.
적인 그 사례들을 들면서 이 한국이
Can you give us some examples and give us some golden time of Korea? I think the golden time was like 5 years ago, up until 5 years ago, where the United States and China had a shared goal. But in this new environment, how Korea can make its voice heard. And China and the United States are promoting diverse strategies. And what kind of changes do we need to see from Korean side? So can you share with us the Korean perspectives? Good morning. I am An Jun-sung, an attorney at law from the U.S. Before I start my presentation, let me just provide a short comment about the speech that I just heard from the two speakers. I personally agree, and if I recall the keywords of what Jordan Bateman said, I think technological decoupling was the biggest keyword, and from China's side, I think efficiency improvement was a major keyword. So I think he focused on productivity. Listening those two sides, I think it is in line with Korea's perspective basically. Just like Professor Liu mentioned, from Korea's side, Korea was in the best situation when the United States and China were cooperating with each other well. In the United States, they say technological decoupling, but from Korean side, I think we are seeing a decoupling with the United States because of the one-directional sanctions. And also we are seeing decoupling away from China as well in Korea because of the political issues maybe and the thought deployment issue and so on and so forth. So in the time of decoupling from Korean perspective, I think what we have to focus on is efficiency rather than hegemony. When it comes to efficiency, when the global supply chain is stable and being developed, to enhance efficiency, I think Korea is thinking the hardest among all the major players to enhance the overall efficiency of the global supply chain. My presentation will focus on sharing two examples or two cases that recently happened. Let me just be brief. I took one from the US and one from China. The picture is actually from the 16th of August when he was signing the IRA or Inflation Reduction Act. And by signing this IRA, the Korean automakers were hit directly. So I think this can be seen as a starting point of another decoupling. This has created a lot of issues, not only in Korea, but beyond. And from the efficiency perspective, I think the IRA might pose difficulties as well because we import a lot of raw materials from China and make products to export them to the United States. But under the new act, it's going to be very difficult to do that because we are currently stuck in the middle, basically. As for the China case, at the end of last year, there was a urea shortage situation in Korea, and this created a huge controversy and fuss in Korea. In 2017, there was a big controversy and conflict regarding thought deployment, and people thought that this is like a déjà vu from the controversy over thought. There might be diverse reasons behind this shortage of urea, but the biggest factor, according to media, was that China placed a ban on the export of urea from their country to us. And from Chinese government perspective, if you look at the official announcement, actually it is different from the unofficial or unofficial announcement. So what is the intent, motive or ulterior motive of the Chinese government? That was a big issue in Korea. And if you look at the issues raised by the Chinese media, they were mentioning that many Korean companies such as Samsung or SK Hynix were transferring data of Chinese companies, including Huawei, to the United States to cooperate more with the United States. And I think this kind of has created an anti-sentiment to Korea. So from Korean perspective, it only led to more controversy, and this undermined credibility and trust between Korea and China because there were all diverse interpretations of what was going on. And I think when it comes to the communication with China, I think there are two types. I mean, the sanctions placed by China are two types. Some of them are official and some of them are unofficial. As for the thought related repatriation, many people thought that although China didn't make it clear or official, many people thought that China wanted to get back to us after we thought about the deployment of thought. And as for the official economic sanction, we can cite boycott against Australian coal as an example. It's reasonable from their side, but as for Korea, we were relying very much on China when it comes to the import of urea. And if you look at the urea situation in Korea, many Korean companies wanted to find a breakthrough out of this situation and decided to develop an alternative material that can be used instead of urea, which was ammonium carbonate. So we can see that diverse issues were all entangled here. And one of the reasons behind this fuss was that we were deeply reliant on China, one specific country basically, be it China or Russia. Like high dependency on one single country is risky because we can be subject to the external factors or political factors. And because of the urea in Korea, the cars and trucks couldn't actually move. It was a big risk. So from Korean perspective, we felt the need to diversify our supply chain. And as for the US case, I think I can cite the IRA as an example. The IRA is now signed. Korean media is trying to focus on what kind of implication it will have to Korean companies and highlighted the fact that the tax credit will be cut BAU. However, actually, if you look at the overall content of the IRA, it both comes with carrots and stick in that even the US companies are not welcoming this act that much. The tax credit is provided to people in the United States if they meet certain standards, but it doesn't seem like there are a lot of people who can be qualified to get this tax credit. And even in the United States, there are huge controversies as to whether IRA can actually lead to the inflation reduction. But having that aside, I think there is another set of controversy regarding EV cars. I want to focus on the minimum tax rate of 15% imposed by the United States over to corporations. I believe you know the concept of Google tax and digital tax trend, and I think the United States is trying to follow in the line of this big trend in the tax scene. But I think this can bring the tax avoidance issue to surface. And in that case, many multicultural companies, including Tesla, have been doing tax avoidance, utilizing tax havens. But I think this law will put big burden on those countries. If you look at the IRA in a broad manner, it is trying to get more tax out of the rich companies and spend it to traditional focal items and topical issues that the Democrats want to focus on, such as well-being, and also here in this case, climate change. And the EV car is mentioned because the law is trying to put more money into climate change actually. Overall, the tax credit you can get is $7,500. And right after the effectuation of the act, the Korean companies cannot get this tax credit or the subsidy at all because we do not qualify the requirements. And there are two categories of getting the tax credit, and one category is critical minerals and the other is battery components. And it is quite complicated. And if you meet the requirements of critical minerals, the maximum tax credit you can get would be $3,750. And also, there are some excluded entities. There is this concept of foreign entity of concern that can include the North Korea, Russia, or China. And to get this subsidy in the United States, we cannot import items from these countries of concern. So I don't think this is going to be practically possible to actually abide by this law and get this credit. In the United States market, if they shut the door, it's going to be, from the efficiency perspective, and from the corporate perspective, this is going to pose a big problem because even Tesla is importing Chinese materials and components to make their cars. And the same applies to Korean companies. And with the decoupling happening, it cuts off the flow. And from company perspective, regardless of the reason of the cutoff in the flow, I think it is certain that this will create a lot of problems. So what I believe is that, speaking of Made in American policy of Biden administration, this might be a short-term benefit to Biden administration if you think about the looming election. But if you think in the long term, I'm not sure if this act and Made in America policy will help the United States and US corporates in the long run. We are not sure. We are still in the gray area. From my opinion, even Tesla and many other US EV car companies will see a lot of problems. That is why I think this act creates a lot of dilemma even to the United States. If all the factories decide to build their own factory in the United States and try to make use of this IRA, wouldn't it undermine the strong foundation that domestic US companies had been enjoying so far, and wouldn't this create the problem of reverse discrimination? And as for Korea, this law kind of came suddenly, so we were not sure and we were not prepared. I think the United States had to hurry because of the election timelines and so on and so forth. And I think the US could have been a little bit more considerate toward the allies, which include us. I think that is partly the reason why the Korean public did not respond well to this act. About the legal solution to this act, I think this is a violation of the cross FDA, but if we try to adopt legal solution to escape out of this dilemma, it's going to take a long time. And as for the WTO, the appeal authority is not working. It is not functional. From the problems that they had from the Trump administration. And when we try to use the dispute resolution process utilizing the FTA provisions, we are not sure how long it will take, and we are also not sure whether it will be effective at all. And that means we have diplomatic solutions as an option. Korea wants coupling, and we want to maintain the global supply chain from our perspective. But because of the US and the China and their problems, we are stuck in the middle and see a lot of problems. And in terms of the negotiations with the United States going forward, I think we have to make a good diplomatic way forward to escape out of this dilemma. Thank you. Thank you for summarizing the Korean strategy and Korean situation. With that, I would like to hand the microphone over to editorial writer Ho Won-soon. Can you just give us a comment and encompass all the presentations you heard?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ho Won-soon, an editorial writer from the Korea Economic Daily. Thank you all for your comments. Back in 1970s and 1980s, the opening and free trade, I believe, began back in 1970s and 80s. Thanks to WTO, we were able to witness GDP growth here in Korea. And the science and technology development also helped the Korean economy. And the global value chains. We were able to take a competitive edge in these global value chains thanks to WTO and liberalism and free trade. And Charles said that this is a matter of business, and I completely agree. However, the reality shows us that there are things more than in business. And I think this has become a mega trend. This China-U.S. tech rivalry, this supply chain issue that we are seeing. The government, they announce a declaration and statement, and sometimes they take quasi-military actions. But I think I mean, we have to think about what people are going through, what the companies are going through. Now there is the inflation, and now you see the asset prices drop and inflation. Why did it occur? And that is because there are problems with the supply chain. So there are inflation. So the countries are increasing interest rate. The U.S. is increasing the rate. So other countries are following, and which is leading to asset price inflation. And if you look at the Korean stock market, it's been poor for some time, and housing prices has declined much more than had anticipated, and so inflation and the asset price decline are making it very painful for everyone. And so I think that U.S. and China tech rivalry is more than a checking game. I think this is going to be a mega trend, and this is clearly a matter of concern. So there should be a restoration of the supply chain. If that is not possible, then effort should be made that things do not get any worse than it currently is. Last year, we had a different topic. I mean, we had some discussion about we were critical of China because China was the had gained the most benefits from WTO, and China was making all those actions against Korea. But looking back, for the past year or so, but if you look at the cross FTA and the RRA of the U.S., if you look at these actions by the United States, I mean, are they? The U.S. is creating new problems. It seems that China is simply following the U.S. I think China is more on the defensive side. And as you have heard and seen, this Ukrainian war. And also there's the North Korean nuclear issue. I mean, this is something that we cannot be separated from. And our Chinese speaker said that this is a business issue. But for us, the supply chain issue is not just a business issue. This is an issue of life or death because this involves the North Korean nuclear issue. And here, this is not just an economic hegemony. This is because economy and security are interlinked, and they cannot be separated. And the fact that economy and security cannot be separated is exacerbating the problem. And with North Korea, we have the security issue, and the U.S. Wants to strengthen the cooperative relationship between Korea, U.S., and Japan. If the U.S. makes that proposal, can we not accept it? I mean, we have to accept it because of the North Korean issue, and we have a history issue with the U.S. Japan. I think we had a component and the materials related friction with Japan a few years ago, and with China. That urea component of the material thing happened. So that was a non-tariff issue. So there are these complex and complicated issues that are occurring with Korea and its neighboring countries. I think we should be rational. We should be reasonable, and there was a development of financing. Seminar was held by the Ministry of Finance yesterday, and I served as a moderator. And if U.S. If the less developed countries can be developed, then it's not just Korea that's going to be benefiting, but it's going to be benefiting the U.S. And China and other countries. And if I may talk something about something that's personal, I hope it's okay. I think about a year and a half ago, my son bought an American EV. And now that EV is about 1.5 times more expensive then. And my wife wanted to change her car in less than a month. The we actually had a test driving of Chinese EV. The performance was good and the price was good. So we'll be buying Chinese EV. And I actually have a drone that was made by China. I really love that drone. And so this product enhance conveniences, but subsidies and are making things complicated. I mean, do consumers like me, do we have to think about about subsidies, about these diplomacy issues? I mean, shouldn't we just buy these products if they can help us live easier and better lives? And China, I believe, is the biggest benefactor of free trade. And I believe that the U.S. Has played important role for liberal trade regime and WTO, and I hope that U.S. will continue to maintain that stance. And I want to, but since I don't have time right now, but when another opportunity is given to me, I want to say something critical about the new Korean government.
대해서 한 1분만
I can give you a minute to talk critical about the new government. Well, as you know, we have a new government here in Korea, and there are many changes as a result. And in the National Assembly, we have the opposition party, the majority. And so the political landscape is very complicated. And the U.S. has passed the IRA and is working on bills related to biotechnology. But it seems that Korean government, I don't know how to say this, slow, complacent, are not able to, I mean, they do not have any accurate information about what the U.S. government is doing. And can I use the word lobbying? Anyway, the Korean government should have a lobbying activity. And I mean, there's the course agreement. I think that the government should have taken actions to ensure that there are no damages done to the Korean industries. I don't know what the Korean embassy in the U.S. is doing. I mean, there are a lot of people there. What are they doing? And so what is the Korean government doing? So I just wanted to say that. So I'll stop here.
감사합니다.
Thank you. As a moderator, to summarize what he just said, I think Mr. Hall has just talked about 3 points. 1. China has benefited from the global trade, and Korea still has a bad dream about China's get back to Korea when it comes to trade and trade retaliations. The global supply chain have benefited both Korea and China. However, after benefiting from global trade, China kind of conducted some trade retaliation against Korea. And he cited some company examples to support his argument. And second, about the United States, there had been diverse collaboration between the United States and Korea, and the US did help Korea to develop further. But recently, multiple, very diverse and numerous offensive strategies are at work simultaneously, which of course includes IRA. Then from Korea perspective, who should I trust? Who should Korea trust? If things change so rapidly from this side and that side at the same time, who should we trust? And third, about Korea, what are we doing? He said the Korean government is not doing and is not reading what is going on. So experience-based comment was just provided by editorial writer Hall, I guess. I think all the speakers and panelists already must have something to comment about the other speakers' perspective. But let me move on to the Q&A session for now. I think when answering your question, you can add your comment about other speakers or the panelists' thoughts or presentation. My first question is, like I said, in the United States, there are diverse conflicting opinions, and I think it must be true for China as well, in particular from business perspective. Because of the unique political structure of China, there can be limitations, but from the business perspective, just like Dr. Liu mentioned, I think there must be some people who think differently, a little bit differently from the government stance or the Communist Party's stance or position. The cases of Tesla or Alibaba or Apple can some of the good examples of what we are trying to talk about here. But traditionally, we thought that in the United States, we will never see government trying to dominate the market. And in China, we believe that however the strong government is, I believe what's important is market based on what is going on right now. Then about the situation, what are the internal opinions you hear from the United States point of view? What are the conflicting opinions regarding the Tesla case or the Apple case and so on and so forth? I think I can give you all and each of you for about 2 minutes to answer this question. What are the different conflicting opinions about the internal issues?
John, Dr. Bateman, would you like to make comments first?
To answer that question about conflicting opinions in the United States by commenting on the other side of some of the criticisms that I made before. So in my talk, I was somewhat critical of US policy, saying that we lacked a strategy, describing this push toward decoupling and worrying that we're going too far. And many of the other speakers after me generally were worried about this decoupling trend and felt that we needed to return toward efficiency and market-based positive relations in the realm of technology. I do want to give some credence, however, to the legitimate concerns that are driving those in the US government that have been implementing some of these decoupling policies. All of the 9 issues that I outlined as US objectives are actually quite legitimate and are driven in large part by Chinese behavior that is of great concern to the American government. So just to take a few examples, it is very conceivable that in the coming years, China could attack Taiwan and the US government could find itself in armed conflict with China. That means it's quite rational to worry about the transfer of technology that could have dual uses or military applications. We're also very concerned in the United States about human rights abuses in China, particularly the treatment of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, which is of a scale that has not been seen before in a country that is so important and a major trading partner of the United States. So that's a really serious dilemma. And of course, we have heard from the other speakers about some of China's failure to uphold its commitments under the open trading system and other international economic obligations. So I just want to say that for people like me who are of centrist persuasion and who are worried about this path toward unlimited decoupling, it's really our obligation to acknowledge the legitimacy of the underlying concerns and to try to articulate a reasonable middle path to balance those concerns against the risks and costs of decoupling. We have heard a lot about efficiency from the other speakers, and I think it's fair to say that the days where efficiency was the sole or primary value guiding global economic policy are over. There are so many other things that are of concern now, whether that's resilience, national security, values, of course, how we actually implement this new world and what values it'll be based on remain to be determined.
네, 감사합니다. 그 다음에는
Thank you. Next Can I ask Mr. Liu Charles Yangsheng to talk about the diverse opinions that exist inside of China, relatively speaking, in China? I think it's a little bit difficult for the private sector and the public sector to have different opinions, but still, I want to hear your opinion.
Lots of over policies to be taken in regards to the United States, in regards to Europe, in regards to domestic policies in addressing the economic slowdown, in regards to treatment of the COVID-19 policies and so on. There are a lot of diversity, but there are some things which there is totally unified view in China. Independent surveys have shown over 90% have significant confidence in the government of handling things. In terms of efficiency, which Dr. Weidman had just talked about, there are some issues with that because the pressure is on now for carbon emission targets and environmental protection programs. Now, many entrepreneurs are not happy about that because it increases their costs. But what we've seen in Beijing, for example, over the last 10 years, it's not the market forces that create a blue sky. We now have basically no longer any pollution in Beijing. It's because of very hard government pressure and policy and very, very strict implementation. I'd just like to get back to one thing that Dr. Weidman said. Having lived in Beijing, lived in China now for over 30 years, on the human rights front, I think the concept of human rights may be quite different in the West. We're concerned over the last 30 years over getting rid of poverty, bringing food to everyone's table. Now, this human rights thing, in terms of the Uyghurs, it is so absurd that 56 Islamic countries, not a single one complained. It's the US and a few Europeans who jumped up and down about the Uyghurs. I've been to Xinjiang many times. I have some businesses there, actually. And what was described by CIA reports are totally, completely out of the question. And my many Islamic country ambassadors visited there too. And I will put this to you. How do you address human rights issues when you have billionaires and billionaires galore in the US and companies making tens of billions of dollars a year, and you have 550,000 people who are homeless and live on the streets? That's not human rights. So I think the US should look at itself first before criticizing people on human rights, on aggressiveness toward others, on not being proper in terms of international trade relations. All this complaint about Chinese subsidies over their companies, what do we see now in the US? It's all anti-market, anti-efficiency forces. And in the Chinese populace, I think 10 years ago, we admired the US. Many young people even worship the US. But in China today, I think the US government policies, its leadership, injecting Clorox into your vein and broadcasting that all over the world has become absurd. So I think the US has really lost a lot of its glory over the last decade or so, especially the last 5 years. The Chinese are very united on feeling being attacked aggressively by the US for no reason. Well, they consider to be no reason. Thank you.
오케이, 감사합니다. 민주주의와 휴먼
Yes, thank you. Discussions about democracy and human rights were discussed quite often in the arena of international politics. There's the Western perspective and there's the Asian perspective, and I think those two perspectives are very different. So we do have to think about culture, and we do have to think about philosophical aspects. And we also have to think about history, I mean, because we do have different histories, and so we do have to discuss, history and the philosophy, because when we're going to be talking about this difference in terms of perspectives on human rights, and about Korea, except for 1970s and 1980s. I believe that the private sectors have been leading in important issues. So the private sectors were faster and more efficient than the government. And when we talk about, chip 4 issues, the semiconductor companies have said that we would not be really losing out if we do work with the U.S. So I understand that's what the semiconductor companies' positions are. And of course, the Korean government has announced that it's going to be joining Chip 4. And if you look at Korean economy, well, 28% of it depends on trade or the interaction with China. And there are other sectors, besides semiconductors. So there are different voices from the private sectors and the government. And so there are differing opinions between the government and different stakeholders. Can you talk about this for 2 minutes?
예,
Thank you. Let me be brief and talk about the internal opinions from Korean side. I think being here, I come to think about this. I think the core aspects of our discussion unexpectedly are these. One, COVID-19. COVID-19 has brought a huge impact to the global economy. Even the biggest economic superpower, the United States, was hit. China was hit as well. And the same applies to Korea in many aspects. And many are criticizing the government for this economic hardships that we are facing because of the COVID-19. And that is partly the reason why the government is trying to find their excuses and try to find their way out. And another thing is the Ukraine crisis. COVID-19 and the Ukraine war, I think, have impacted all countries around the world and has expressed itself, by impact. The impact was expressed in diverse forms in different countries. In China, different levels of policies were put out in the United States, and the impact was expressed in the form of IRA. From Korean perspective, I think rather than different opinions, I think there are complaints from car companies, basically, or many other companies. 20 years ago, I was working as an intern in the Congress of the United States, and I was surprised. Back then, I contacted 20 Asian country embassies working in Washington, D.C., and invited about 24 ambassadors from Asian countries. I remember inviting China and Japanese, but nobody came from one specific country. No one. And that was the Embassy of Korea. I called the Embassy of Korea to the States and said, please come visit. I'm Korean as well. I'm Korean myself. But the personnel from the embassy told me that the headquarters in Korea didn't want the embassy to visit the event I was organizing. In China, when I call people, good higher senior people come to the Congress, high-ranking senior officials would come to Congress upon being called and try to lobby. And the same applies to other countries, and nobody came to the US Congress despite being called. Now, after the IRA, many say that we were betrayed, but I kind of get the US situation. When it comes to many other countries, they say that we can hear that many other companies and countries were lobbying to get their deal passed and get their promise delivered. But didn't Korea know anything, or did it do nothing, even knowing what was going on? I really hope that what I experienced 20 years ago in the US Congress does not repeat now. If we knew what was going on, why weren't we working hard? I think that is the biggest complaint I hear from the business side. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Let's move on to the next question. So, politics. It seems to be ruling technology, economy, and market. So, how long do you think this is going to last? And so that's my next question. As John Bateman had said in his report, where is the responsible stopping point? And I want to add a strategic point here. And, to talk about responsibility is just not enough because of the national interests, things are moving too quickly. And as there are different opinions, market, it's not something we can control. And the U.S. has increased its tariff on China, and the U.S. government is thinking about reducing that tariff. Now, China has had sanctions against Australia, which caused electrical outage. So there was this the unintended consequences. So this situation, how much longer this is going to last? Now, how long? So I'm going to give you about a minute to three people. So let's hear from the U.S. John, would you like to go first?
I'll do my best. Although if I truly knew how long this period of decoupling would last and how far the trajectory would go, I would probably be betting on the stock market rather than working in a think tank. Let me say that I think that the current trend will continue for the foreseeable future because the fundamental drivers are somewhat locked in. And I think we've even seen that on the panel today. The United States and China have very different perspectives on core issues. And I think each side, to a great degree, feels that it's acting rationally and in its own interest and has difficulty acknowledging its own contributions to the security dilemma, which of course has important economic and technological implications. I worry about a future scenario where decoupling creates feedback loops that become escalatory and self-reinforcing. So, for example, the US takes an action, China takes a responsive action, the US responds in turn, China responds in turn, and all the while, private companies around the world are seeking to get ahead of US government and Chinese government and other governments' policies, and therefore are preemptively withdrawing from global supply chains, from cooperative engagements. And so I worry that these kinds of feedback loops could create an abrupt acceleration of decoupling in the future that no one anticipates. On the other hand, I suppose that one possibility is that US-China relations deteriorate to such a point, or there is some kind of crisis, perhaps an economic crisis, that causes both sides to pull back from the brink and identify how critical it is to maintain some floor or basic minimum in the technological relationship and the broader bilateral relationship. So those are a couple possible trajectories.
오케이, 대단히 감사합니다. 아주
Yes, thank you very much. And that was an excellent answer.
듣겠습니다.
Then let me invite the Chinese perspective about this question.
Yes, I certainly hope that the trajectory, as Dr. Bateman moves in a different direction. But I think from what I see, it's not just the rise of China. What we've seen in the last 3 decades is actually the rise of Asia with the Chinese market at its core. The relationship between ASEAN countries and even Middle Eastern countries in terms of trade, in terms of exchange, in terms of even scientific supply chain intermingling has been very, very positive over the last decade or so. Now, from a geopolitical point, I'm not a geopolitical scientist, but what I see is Ukraine was used as a proxy against Russia. And now I don't see any country in Asia willing to be that proxy for the United States against China. 5 years ago, 7 years ago, maybe Philippines was doing things which were aggressive against China, Vietnam, and so on and so forth. But all of that has moved away. And in the last 3 years, the Middle Eastern countries have moved very close to China because U.S. used to be buyers of their oil and gas, but with shale oil and shale gas, U.S. has become a competitor. So the biggest buyer is now China. So I think globally there are some changes. I think the U.S. has to accept the fact that it's now a multipolar world and not think of itself as the king of the hill and still trying to dominate. China has not been aggressive and has been, as John said, has been reacting to U.S. moves. But this escalation can be very, very dangerous, potentially leading to war. We certainly don't hope it goes in that direction. But what we have seen in terms of the climate change, in terms of the acceleration of the deterioration of the environment, and devastation all over the world. 1/3 of Pakistan is now underwater. 35 million people out of home. There's no mainstream Western coverage of that. But those of us who are here are doing what we can to provide support to the refugees in Pakistan. These are things which are affecting the livelihood of people. No more food, grain, all over Africa being basically burned by the sun. That will lead to social instability all over the world as well. These are things which are strategic, which I think real statesmen should stand up, be counted, and try to deal with, instead of this petty battles that we see today.
네,
Thank you.
네, 감사합니다. 다음은
Thank you.
perspective.
Now let's hear about the Korean perspective. I'm going to give you a minute.
Thank you. Let me be brief. If you look at the current situation, we are talking a lot about decoupling, but efficiency. But from Korean perspective, it is the issue of life or death. It is the issue of survival. Can we survive? Companies think if they are going to be able to survive. So I hope that we can just solve this issue as soon as possible. That would be it.
코멘트.
I think that was too brief. Anyway, thank you. We don't have much time left. And Dr. Liu, Charles, said that a possibility of cooperation for global issues such as climate change. And I think everyone would agree that this is something that we could all work together. Although right now there is a clear rivalry competition between the US and China. But we need to be able to restore our supply chain. We need to build a resilient supply chain. Everybody's thinking about this. They may have different, thinking as to how to do this. But can we revert back this decoupling? And it's going to take time. So this rival relations between the U.S. and China. So at least, when it comes to supply chain, I think there's still room for cooperation between U.S. and China. So I would like to hear U.S.'s and China's perspective on this. So for each other. So for national interests and for a global economy. So what are possible points of cooperation between the U.S. and China? So a minute. So John, would you like to go first, please?
Yes, and that's such an important question. And I want to just affirm what Dr. Liu was talking about in terms of climate change being an essential area for U.S.-China cooperation. I think this is widely recognized and often cited as perhaps the most important possibility for bilateral cooperation, including in the realm of technology. And there was a recent positive step by the Biden administration. I'm thinking of their decision to suspend an investigation of China-derived solar panels, which could help speed their deployment in the United States and thus reduce carbon emissions over time. But I think that it's very important for both sides to not only discuss climate change as the bilateral opportunity du jour, but to actually tangibly show to each other and to their own domestic constituencies and to the world that there are real practical possibilities there. And if we can do that, then perhaps we could grow toward cooperation in other areas and create some ballast or balance in the relationship. If we cannot do that in the area of climate change, then it is unlikely that we'll be able to foster cooperation elsewhere.
네, 감사합니다. 다음은
Yes, thank you.
퍼스펙티브 부탁드립니다.
Then from China, please, over to you, Dr. Liu.
Thank you, Dr. Bateman, for your comments on this. If we cannot address this issue of climate change, how can we collaborate on anything else? In terms of climate change, China made a commitment last year no longer to fund through its state-owned funds coal-fired power plants elsewhere in the world, and received a lot of complaints from Africa as a result, because Africa said, okay, all of you developed countries and you, China, have already built all these coal-fired power plants, be emitting this stuff for decades, if not centuries. Now you tell us we can't have electricity, we can't afford nuclear power plant. So there are, I think, a lot of social and international diplomatic issues involved. But in terms of the supply chain overall, I think it's not a US-China issue per se, because the China supply chain, the China core supply chain is really, all of Asia is in it, including Korea. I think Japan's China Plus One strategy that was implemented about 10 years ago has seen the results of this effort, leading to a more sophisticated supply chain in which China still plays a very critical part. So I think the disengagement of China in the supply chain is going to have major impact on Asian countries overall. Like we talk about the survival of Korea, life and death, but I think many other countries in Asia are feeling the same way. So I think the US strategist has to consider its impact on its friends, including this friendshoring and so on, and disengagement with China and its impact on other Asian countries. Thank you.
네, 대단히 감사합니다. 오늘
Thank you so much. The time is up. I'm sorry that we couldn't give you enough time, but I think still we had a very productive discussion. To wrap up as a moderator, about the standpoint of China and the United States, I hope that both of the countries do not try to win battle. I hope that you move your strategy towards the ones that can help you win a war. Sometimes you win battles, but you lose the war. I think we have to have this long-term view in devising the strategy, and I think this will definitely benefit Korea. And from the Korean government perspective, I hope that the Korean government can be a little bit smarter and be more creative and be more agile in responding to the external changes, and I think this will help greatly all the stakeholders to survive better in the market. Thank you for the insightful and fruitful discussions we had. I think that all these think tankers can actually serve as action tanks and influence diverse policymakers in all across the country, in countries all around the world. Thank
그럼
you very much.
이것으로
And this
세션을
would wrap up the
마치겠습니다.
session.
잠시 휴식 시간을 가진 뒤 계속해서 다음 세션이 진행될 예정이오니 많은 참여 부탁드립니다. 감사합니다.
Thank you all for such remarkable talks. Then, this concludes our session. After having 30 minutes break, we will come back to another session. We would like
Thank
to
you
ask
very much.
for your continuous support
It's late
and
here,
interest.
so I'll be signing off.
Thank you.